Welcome to the G5 Hive, the next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be heading over to Conference USA to take a look at the Kennesaw State Owls, who finished 2-10 in 2024. They wrapped up their 2025 spring practice with final practice on April 5th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is the sports copy editor for the Kennesaw State Sentinel. He is the co-host of the Owl Chat podcast. He is the sports correspondent for the Marietta Daily Journal. He is also an Atlantic Sun and Conference USA hoops guy. He is Kai Millette. Kai can be found on X at Owl Chat Podcast. Welcome to the show, Kai.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justice. Good to be back. Had a good time last year. I'm excited to maybe be a little more optimistic this time around.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some reason for optimism. I was talking earlier, and it wouldn't shock me, like third through was it there 12 teams in the league now? 10?
Yes, with the addition of Missouri State and Delaware, there's 12. But then this is also our last year of UTEP being in the conference, so I think We'll be looking to add another
11 or another addition, maybe.
Yeah. So maybe somebody else drops out. Maybe New Mexico State does something else, or maybe we add another and get it back to an even 12. But for this year, it is 12.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me, though. Like 3 through 12, whatever that order is, it's just, I don't know. It should be competitive and fun. So for those who are tuning into the G5 Hive for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been covering Kennesaw State football?
Yeah, so this will be my third full year covering KSU football. I am a student at KSU. I'm heading into my senior year. This will be my last year on campus before I decide to move on to other things. But yeah, I've had a lot of fun doing it. I am the sports editor for our student paper, The Sentinel. Started the Owl Chat podcast almost exactly 2 years ago to the date with my co-host John, who people who are familiar with KSU Twitter will recognize. Been doing that for a while, and then I do a bunch of high school sports and some additional KSU stuff on the side with the Marietta Daily Journal, which is the local paper in Cobb County where KSU is at.
Awesome. Well, let's move over to some Kennesaw State football. And the Owls have hired Jerry Mack as their new head coach. This will be his first stint as a head coach. He spent 2024 as the Jacksonville Jaguars running back coach. From 21 to 23, he was running back coach for the Tennessee Volunteers. Prior to that, he was at Rice from 2018 to 2020. Where he served as an offensive coordinator and a quarterbacks coach. And then in the 2019 and 2020 seasons at Rice, he was also named an assistant head coach. What can you tell us about Coach Mack and what he brings to the table for the Owls?
So, little correction for you. This is not going to be his first stint as a head coach. He was at North Carolina Central for 3 or 4 years before he went to Rice. A lot of experience. He's been around a lot of good football. You know, he's coached at the highest level with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He was part of that Tennessee turnaround under Josh Heupel that we've seen over the last, 4 or 5 years, where they've kind of returned to glory, to say. I guess sort of. So, he was a big part of changing that culture. I mean, all of those coaches and players that were there with him at Tennessee think the world of him, so it seems. And then, it was at a lower level. It was at the FCS level with NC Central, but, the guy won a lot of football games. I think they won their conference 2 or 3 times, had an appearance in the Celebration Bowl, had a record like 31-15. So the guy's a winner from what we can tell and has been around mostly winning in his career.
Well, as it often happens when you get a new head coach, that means new assistants and new coordinators. Kennesaw State is no different in that regard. Coach Mack has hired Mitch Millette to be his offensive coordinator. Coach Millette has spent time being considered, I guess, a tutor of quarterbacks, but not necessarily a quarterback's coach. Can you describe the type of offense that Coach Millette plans to run here at Kennesaw State?
Yeah, I mean, the easy way to answer it is if you've seen Tennessee play, that's sort of the blueprint that we're going to be trying to replicate. The veer and shoot, or the veer and hoot, as some of the people on KSU Twitter have nicknamed it. Vertical heavy in the passing game, a lot of downfield stuff, which, the addition of some of the quarterbacks on this roster this year will make a lot easier. And then, a lot of draw plays, a lot of running the ball from the gun and that sort of thing.
Well, let's start with the group that leads this Owls offense, and that's the quarterbacks. They'll be searching for a new quarterback here in 2025. Preston Clemmer is the only quarterback on the roster. Returning The staff brought in Dexter Williams II from Georgia Southern and Amari Odom from Wofford prior to the spring semester. After the spring, they bring in touchdown Tommy Ulatowski over from Kent State. Can you help us make sense of this room as we head into fall camp?
Sure. Dexter's an interesting case. He came up with Indiana, actually started a couple of games while he was there, had some bad luck with injury, and then was sort of inconsistent when he played. But he ended up at Georgia Southern last year, lost the starting job. And that was sort of a controversial thing from what I hear from my Georgia Southern people. It seemed like, QB1 and QB2 were neck and neck, and they just rolled with their other guy. And I mean, it worked out for him. I think they won 10 games last year. But Dexter's really talented. There's a reason that he was at a Power 5 school. Seeing him throw the ball around during the spring, he's got better touch than any quarterback we've ever seen at Kennesaw State. And that's not a dig on the other quarterbacks we've had. It's just we transitioned from the triple option 2 years ago, and it's been 2 years of pretty rough quarterback play, so it's refreshing to see. I think this is his job to lose. There hasn't been a starter named yet, but I would be pretty shocked if it was anybody but Dexter Williams. I think Ulatowski's probably the second guy right now. He's got experience starting at the Group of 5 level. Wasn't too successful at Kent State, but he likes to push the ball down the field. Really likes to push the ball down the field. Amari Odom, I don't think is a serious contender for the job. I think he's just kind of a guy they brought in to provide some depth, but he once again, has starting experience at the Division I level, started a handful of games at Wofford, and then the freshman Skylar Williams, I'm really excited about. Looked really good throwing the ball around in spring. It's just going to be a matter of, if we get that deep in the depth chart, are the quarterbacks going to want to, or are the coaches going to want to preserve his red shirt, or are they going to want to throw, Skylar Williams out there, who might be a better option than Odom? Hopefully, we're not in that position. It would be ideal for him not to see the field at all this year. It would be great if we had one quarterback start every game. Wishing the injuries away, but that's sort of the lay right now. And then you mentioned Clemmer. That's your walk on. That's your clipboard holder, film room guy. But he does bring some of that Bohannon regime experience over, so he'll be a valuable member in that room.
For those not familiar with Dexter Williams, how would you describe his game?
Big kid, strong arm. You don't want to make comparisons that are too lofty, but you could say like a budget Jamarcus Russell or something like that. Big time arm. First play of the spring game, which was abbreviated, only lasted like 20 to 30 minutes. 60-yard bomb right down the seam to Gabe Benyard, who I'm sure we'll get to here in a minute. Not necessarily the most mobile quarterback, but has escapability, can get out of the pocket and make something happen, but he's not going to be running all over the field like some other guys you might see.
You talk about Amari Odoms. How would you describe his game to folks that aren't familiar with Wofford?
I haven't seen a ton of his tape from Wofford. I know one of his better outings was against South Carolina, I think, when they played against him last year. He's a little inconsistent. I want to stay nice about it, but in the spring he was struggling a little bit. It looked like he was hesitant to make certain reads and forced a couple balls in there, threw a couple of picks in the limited practice that I got to watch. He's smaller than Williams, probably even has more escapability, a little more mobile, can hit the ground a little better. So, he definitely provides good depth. He's not a guy that you would want to be your starter coming into the year, but if he's your QB3, then you feel pretty okay about your quarterback room.
Do you think he's probably the most mobile or the most dual threat type quarterback on the roster?
Yeah, I think that'd be fair to say. Ulatowski, kind of similar to Williams, thicker kid. He's going to throw the ball down the field, and in college football now, you need your quarterback to have some level of escapability. Even if they're not a true dual threat, you need a guy who can get outside the pocket, extend plays, and take off and pick up the 5 or 6 yards when you need them. And I think that's more Dexter Williams, Tommy Ulatowski, and then Amari Odom is more of a true dual threat type of guy who could get out and maybe spread the field a little bit more and create that second level.
Well, moving over to the running back room, the Owls will be without their top 2 rushers from a season ago. Leading rusher Michael Benefield has graduated, while second leading rusher Qua Ashley is off to Ball State. It means the Owls will be looking to replace 96% of their rush attempts and 946 yards from 2024. Of those who saw snaps last year, this room returns Alexander Diggs and DJ Scott. The duo combined for 11 rushing attempts. Staff brings in Chase Belcher from West Georgia and Coleman Bennett from Rice. How did this room look as a whole in the spring? And did anyone stand out for you?
They were banged up in the spring. In the spring game, it was mostly the Coleman Bennett and the Chris Canty show. And Chris Canty is not officially on the roster for some reason. He was a Georgia Military College transfer, and I don't know if that's because he was just killing it in practice and the coaches wanted to give him an opportunity, or if the room was just that banged up. Coleman Bennett seems like the favorite to be that RB1 right now. You know, he comes over from Rice. He was linked to Mac during Mac's time at Rice. I believe, you know, there was that was the reason why he might have ended up at Rice. He was underutilized there. That's the optimistic way to look at it. Belcher's another guy. You know, you're just going to bring in a guy who maybe didn't get the touches that he wanted at UWG and just see what this guy can do. DJ Scott is no longer on the team, actually. But Alexander Diggs is still on the roster. He's one of the, you know, remaining Bohannon survivors. Diggs, you know, looked okay in his limited action over the last couple of years. I wouldn't be surprised if he's still in the mix, but I think it's going to be the Coleman Bennett, Chase Belcher show if guys stay healthy.
Do you think like it's going to be a 1-2 punch, or like Bennett's going to be like the lead with Belcher coming in to relieve him?
I think it's going to be sort of a running back by committee thing, like it was last year. You know, Benefield and Ashley were the guys who were getting the most carries, but I don't think there's anybody who stands out enough to be getting like 70% of the carries, like you would see in some running back rooms around the country. I think especially early in the season, it's going to be like, hey, let's give everybody a shot. Let's see who's got it going. You know, for a lot of these guys, it's going to be the most playing time they've ever had at the college level. You know, so. Like I've been saying, the optimistic way to look at things is one of these guys has to be all right. One of them is going to have to break out. The competition is going to breed success, you would hope. You know, one of these guys is going to step up and improve on what they had done previously in their college careers. But it seems like the coaches really like Bennett a lot. He's a redshirt senior, so this is his final year. I doubt that he transferred into KSU for his last season of eligibility without the intention to play a lot. So I think that's always been the plan for him and the coaching staff.
If we look at just Bennett and Belcher, do their skill sets lend themselves to, you know, are they better at certain things other than others? Like, is one of them like the clear goal line guy and another guy's like a clear pass catching back? Or what do you think? What areas do they excel in?
Yeah, Belcher's a bigger guy. He's probably going to be more of your bruiser type. It hurts to lose the guys like Michael Benefield and Preston Daniels, who was a tight end halfback hybrid last year. So there's not really the same clear goal line guy as there was last year. Gotcha. I think Bennett's the shiftier one, the one you're going to want to get out in space more. And then, you know, if Belcher earns a spot, I think he's going to be more of the short yardage guy. Cause I mean, Bennett's 5'11", 185, and Belcher is 6'1", 218. So, you know, he's a good bit thicker, and you know, and then Diggs is the smallest of them. He's 5'9", 185. So maybe, you know, around the same size, you know, weight wise as Bennett, but, you know, smaller, and you would imagine he would maybe be a little quicker.
All right. If you had to take a guess here in June on who gets that first carry against Wake, or first running back that gets a carry against Wake Forest, who would that be?
I think it'll be Coleman Bennett. I think he'll be the guy that's listed in all the starting lineups. And like I said, we'll see multiple running backs, especially early in the season. It's just going to be like, you know, let's run with the hot hand. But I would put money, if I had to, on Bennett being the guy lining up in the backfield for that first snap.
All right, well, let's turn our attention over to the wide receivers. And this room looks to be one of the strengths of the 2025 team. Despite losing leading receiver Blake Bohannon to Montana, this 2025 squad was seen to be led by a trio of Tykeem Wallace, Gabriel Benyard, and Christian Moss. That trio accounted for 56 receptions, 553 yards, and 2 touchdowns a year ago. They also bring in 2 transfers. What are your expectations for the wide receivers heading into 2025?
Yeah, it's hard to know what to expect, because you expect the quarterback room to make a big jump this year. You know, Davis Bryson, who was the quarterback last year, is now in the wide receiver room. So that's an interesting, you know, little storyline this year. But when your quarterbacks can't get your receivers the ball, it doesn't really matter how good your receivers are. So there's still a lot of unknown. Christian Moss was a guy, he's a local kid. He went to North Cobb High School, which is right up the road from KSU. And he started out at Virginia Tech and actually got playing time as a freshman at the Power 5 level. So there's no doubt he's talented. Showed a lot of flashes last year. He's a sure-handed receiver. He's got speed, had some good moments. Would like to see a lot more out of him. And then Gabe Benyard's the guy I told you last year was really the X factor. And, he missed what felt like 6 or 7 weeks early in the season. So really didn't get to see a whole lot out of him. But he entered the portal after, Bohannon was let go and the season ended. And Jerry Mack was able to go into the portal and pull him back. If he's fully healthy, once again, I think that's going to be the X factor for you in the receiver room. He's sort of a Swiss Army knife, can line up in the backfield, can line up in the slot, can line up maybe even out wide if you need him to. Like I said, first play of the spring game, Dexter Williams hits him, 60 yards down the seam and just puts it right in the basket. That's on paper going to be your most skilled guy in that room. It'll be interesting to see if Davis Bryson, the former quarterback, gets some real run at receiver. I think we're all kind of rooting for him. Stand-up kid, did everything the right way last year, even though things didn't go our way, things didn't go his way. So I think there's a lot of potential in the receiver room. We just haven't been able to see much of it because, they haven't been getting the ball. So intrigued to see what happens in that room more than most of the others.
During the spring, was there any receiver that Dexter seemed to kind of target a lot or favor?
Benyard and Moss. Those are going to be your 1 and 2 more than likely, I'd expect. Moss has a lot of talent. It's just last year was not an ideal situation for anybody. And props to him for sticking it out. Staying at KSU. And fighting to win that spot, and it appears like he's gonna be one of the starters. So
you said Moss and Benyard are probably 2 of the starters. Do you think Wallace is that third guy?
Maybe. Phil Steele put out his magazine a week or 2 ago, and Jordan Jackson was one of the guys that he named as a potential starter. The kid we got coming in from Fresno State, Lyndon Rivera, he got some playing time at Fresno. He's another guy where it's like, maybe he just fell down the depth chart because of politics or whatever. He had a handful of catches as a young player, so you never know. It's a lot of unknowns. Like the running backs, you'll see a lot more guys earlier in the season, I would imagine. And then, injuries are going to happen. So I would expect to see all of these guys. They're going to go pretty deep at receiver, I think. They did last year with a different coaching staff, but you just got to figure out what works.
Well, with that coaching change, what have you been able to learn in terms of how the tight ends will be utilized in this offense?
Hopefully more, but once again, it's a product of the quarterback. We brought some guys in. They're undersized for tight ends, which I like. Takes away from their blocking ability maybe, but you're going to be running this up-tempo offense. You want to get tight ends out in space and utilize them more as pass catchers than run blockers in all likelihood, like Gerard Bullock, who could very well be the starter this year, transfers in from Tennessee State. He's something like 6'1", 200 pounds, which is a really small tight end. But he was a starter at the FCS level. And there's clearly a reason for that.
Was Bullock the one that he was either one that kind of standing out in the spring at the tight end position?
I think he committed after the spring.
Gotcha.
So we didn't have a whole lot of access to spring practice while it was going on. Did get a chance to go to the spring game. I don't know if there was a single tight end completion. But it's hard to compare this year and last year because, different coaching staffs, different schemes, and all that. But you lose Carson Kent, who was one of your most productive offensive players last season at tight end, and now he's at Oklahoma. And from what we're hearing, he's got a chance to, be the number 1 or number 2 guy in the SEC, which is great for him. But, you got to find a way to make up that production, even though it might be unfair to compare. So it's going to be another case of, look, this is a new experiment all around. Who's going to step up? Nobody has a safe job. There's no safe job on this roster. Go out and play, and, we're going to ride with who gives us the best chance to win.
Well, moving over to the offensive line, they'll have to figure out a new offensive line rotation. They only returned 2 starters in left guard J.T. Pennington and right tackle Seaburn Hines. Additionally, they only returned one other lineman who took snaps in 2024, and that was left tackle Caleb May. They bring in 6 transfers in the first portal window, 3 more in the second. I got to admit, I'm a little bit nervous about this line heading into 2025, especially you look at that early schedule with Wake and Indiana up first. But how do you feel about this room, and what are your expectations?
I feel like it can only get better. It's good to see Pennington and Hines back. That being said, I think they're going to get shuffled out of their starting spots. I think they'll still be in their rotation.
Okay.
But there are some nice pickups out of the portal. I mean, we went too deep on the O-line out of the portal. I think they brought in 10 or 11 guys. I think you said 9. I think it ended up being 10 or 11. And just upgraded size all around and got some solid experience too. Jadarius Lee, he didn't have a great PFF rating when he was at Arkansas State. You can read into that however much you'd like to. But he's a guy that, was a full-time starter at a group of 5 school on one of the better offensive lines in the Sun Belt. And then Brandon Best is a guy who was a fringe starter / permanent rotational guy at Georgia Tech. He was 3-star recruit coming out of high school, and Tech had a really solid offensive line last year, so that might have just been product of the guys in front of him being better. But now he's going to get a chance to start. And another guy who might end up starting is Nikola Milovac, who's a Serbian kid who was previously at USF. Big kid. I mean, I remember walking into the spring game and hanging out on the sidelines and seeing him and being like, wow, I don't remember us having that size on the offensive line last year. So, I mean, I've been talking about unknowns this whole time. By far, this is the biggest wild card on the team. No idea what this is going to look like, and it's going to take a lot of time to gel on the offensive line. You get a lot of guys who haven't started, haven't gotten heavy reps, and virtually none of these guys have played with each other outside of Pennington and Hines. But there's kind of the feeling that it can only get better from what we had going on last year. So, yeah, I cautiously optimistic, I would say, about the O-line. It needs to be better, and it would be hard to get worse.
Well, let's say this offensive line exceeds expectations and plays really, really well. If that were the case, what guy would you point to and say it's because of that guy? He played lights out, or stepped his game up to the next level. Who would that be?
I think Brandon Best is the one that excites me the most, and that's the Georgia Tech transfer, just because he's a really experienced college football player. He's just a guy that's played in big-time SEC stadiums, played big-time college football, and held his own. So not only from, a skill set standpoint on the field, but a leadership standpoint is you're going to need a guy like that to be really vocal. And, when offensive lines get close and have time to gel, that might be your tightest knit group on the team. It needs to be. So I think that's equally as important to anything, is that these guys gel the right way and have that, camaraderie. And I think, having Hines and Pennington return, those guys, they weren't necessarily the best producers on the offensive line last season, but they're stand-up characters. They're going to be vocal. They're going to be veterans on this team. They've been to war. They've been in the worst kind of foxholes, last season. So it's going to be about playing with a chip on your shoulder for a lot of these guys. But in all honesty, no idea what to expect. I hope they overachieve, and that's what I'm going to stick with. Is it can't get any worse. So.
All right. If you were to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
I'm going to go with Christian Moss. I think if Christian Moss has solid quarterback play, he could be a 600 yard, 700 yard, 800 yard type of receiver. He's not going to be the true wide receiver one who goes out and catches, 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns. I think that's an unrealistic expectation, but I think he could see a massive jump in production this season with the improved quarterback play that we're all hoping for.
All right, well, let's move over to the defense. And just like the offensive side of the ball, there's a new coach on the defensive side. Mark Mattioli is the new defensive coordinator. Coach Mattioli has an interesting background, to say the least. In 2024 and 2023, he was the head coach for the Paris Musketeers in the European League of Football. In 2022, he was the head coach for the Parma Panthers and led them to their first Italian league title since 2013. His last stint in the States was working with the defensive staff at Vanderbilt. Can you describe the type of defensive scheme or style that Coach Mattielli plans to use here at Kennesaw State?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of tape on the Paris Musketeers, or whatever they were called. It's definitely an interesting background. I don't think it'll be anything too crazy. I mean, I think you'll stick with your typical 4-3 with some variation, like you would see around the rest of college football. Yeah, it's an intriguing one. It's a wild card to bring in, but he seems like a guy that's really passionate about what he wants to do. And for some of these assistants, especially the coordinators, this is kind of their big break. This is their first quote unquote big time college football gig. They're a coordinator at the FBS level. So I think you're doing it the right way by going out and getting guys that want to be hungry. No matter where you are, no matter what the competition level is, if you win, that's a good sign. So even if you're winning over in Europe, that's a good indicator that this guy cares. Not that there are guys who don't care, but this guy's hungry and wants to continue climbing the ladder throughout their career, and hopefully sees this as the next step for him, and puts out a great product.
Well, let's dig into the position rooms. Coach Mattielli will be coaching. Let's start with the guys up front along that defensive line. The Owls graduated a good one in edge, Jordan Miles. He led the team in pressures and sacks a season ago. This 2025 squad would look to be anchored by Jondarian Silas off the edge and Tylen Dunlap in the middle. That duo combined for 6 sacks in 2024. There's also a fair amount of depth returning here. Did anyone stand out to you in the spring?
I think the biggest thing that stands out is not a player, but the continued progression of the Brian Bohannon holdovers. A good bit of the secondary is going to be returners, which is, a rare bit of stability and continuation on this team. Guys like Jericho Washington, who entered the portal and Mac was able to pull him back out. He was one of our best all-around players last year on either side of the ball. Tyler Hallam, has had some really solid moments at corner last year. I would expect him to probably start again. Mylan Jones, another local kid, is a guy that I would expect to be, a big time contributor in the secondary. So that's interesting. And then the D line's going to be, several new faces, a couple old ones, Tylon Dunlap and Adam Watkins. Are guys who are also holdovers from that Bohannon era. And then the linebackers, Denelius Johnson and Garland Benyard, Garland, the brother of Gabe, also returners. There's a lot more experience on the defensive side of the ball. And at times, people like to complain about the defense. The defense kept us in several games that we had no business being in last year, with how bad the offense was at times. So if they can be middle of the road in the conference, I think we're going to be all right in that regard.
If you go, looking specifically at the defensive line, I mentioned the loss of Jordan Miles and his ability to create pressure. Who do you think the staff will look to here in 2025 to kind of create that pressure on opposing quarterbacks?
I think Roderick Daniels is one to watch out for. Marcus Patterson. Those are two newcomers that they're excited about, who are projected to start depending on where you look. Ugonna Nwoha is another local kid who entered the portal towards the end of last season. They pulled him back out. Now he's back on the team. When the D-line was really, really banged up last year, late in the season, he was one of the guys that stepped up and kind of held the fort down and made us look respectable. So that's who I'd roll with.
You mentioned the linebackers, and that room looks to be in great shape heading into the season. Returning the starters, Benyard and Johnson, like you mentioned, they each had 3 sacks a year ago. They will need to replace Jalen Barnum, but it looks like they have plenty of options there. How did the linebackers as a whole look in the spring, and who do you think is ready to kind of make that jump or take their game to the next level in 2025?
Would love to see even more out of Denelius Johnson. I think he's a high ceiling type of guy. Garland Benyard, like we were talking about, I mean, maybe the most consistent player on the defense. Had some really big moments in crucial points last year to keep us in some games. I mean, made 3 or 4 huge plays when we played Middle Tennessee in a game that was pretty wire to wire. It was a bad offensive football game, and I don't recommend going and watching the replay. But yeah, I think you want to get consistency out of your starters, and beyond that, it's kind of the same thing. It's going to be whoever comes into camp and steps up and proves that they're playable. But we don't really know what that looks like right now.
Well, moving over to the secondary, and you mentioned earlier, like it looks like to maybe be one of the strengths of the defense. They return their top 3 defensive backs in terms of snaps, and Tyler Hallam, Drico Washington Jr., and Isaac Paul. And they also bring in 3 transfers in the first portal window and 4 in the second portal window. What should we expect from the secondary here in 2025?
Stability. I think they're going to be pretty good. We had pretty good by a reasonable standard. They were one of our more consistent groups last year. Isaac Paul struggled a lot. I don't think he'll be starting again this year. I could see him getting replaced. But as for Drico Washington and Tyler Hallam, I think you got a very good chance of having that be your DB1 and DB2. And then Mylan Jones at safety is a guy who had a really solid run of games around the middle of the season last year. I expect him to be a contributor as well, like I mentioned. And then beyond that, it's a bunch of portal additions and young guys who are going to be fighting for those 2 deep spots.
You talk about the portal additions, and it seemed like most of those guys were safeties. Do you feel like that was depth, or there's going to be opportunities for some of those guys to start?
Like I said earlier, I don't think there's a single position on the roster. I mean, even including quarterback, that's a set thing right now. I think you're gonna see all sorts of predictions and projections from every magazine, every website, trying to project the starting lineup. But we're, as of this recording, I think like 66, 67 days away from the first snap, and fall camp hasn't even started, so there's going to be a lot of shuffling around, and it's going to be a matter of just who looks the best. It's very much just an open competition all around, which in a year like this, that's what you like. You don't want to have things set. You don't want to have biases from the coaching staff. You need to roll with what you got, and this continuation of a rebuild that didn't have a setback, but sort of a reset with the Jerry Mack hire is, there's nothing set. You got to roll with what's best.
Well, let's assume that this secondary is lights out as we might expect. In that scenario, who is responsible for that success?
I think Drico Washington is poised to have another big year. Hoping he stays healthy. I would like to see Tyler Hallam improve even more. He was a guy that wasn't necessarily an X factor, but gave you a lot of significant snaps, and I think it's a good indication when guys are willing to come back and are projected to be starters of what they're about, and their dedication to the program, their teammates, and just wanting to win. So,
well, just like the offensive side, on the defensive side, if you were to pick a breakout player to have a outstanding season here in 2025, who would that be?
Ooh, well, so there was Donovan Westmoreland, who missed all of last season due to injury, and that was supposed to be your big time edge rusher. Getting him back this year, hopefully fully healthy. It's sort of not taboo, but sort of a thing the coaches have been keeping under wraps, his status. If he's fully healthy, sky's the limit in terms of his potential. He was the first player that the program went out and got, with any sort of NIL money. And obviously a huge disappointment that we didn't get to see him last year, but he's a guy who, if he's fully healthy, will hopefully get to see some of, what we were excited about when he committed over a year ago.
Well, we've talked some offense, we've talked some defense. Now let's head over to the special teams. How are those units looking, and are there any concerns?
So Jacob Ulrich, our punter, hit the portal last offseason, ended up at Oklahoma. He's got potential to be an All-American punter, so that's a tough loss. Luckily enough, Joshua Hewitt, who was the guy behind him, actually started the year prior. So he's been a starting punter, and he was as consistent as they come. Zero complaints about him. Ulrich was just the man. So, he took over the job, but Hewitt should hold down the punting situation just fine. Brought in another kid from Australia to maybe push Hewitt and maybe be the next guy up. And then a kicker, lost Austin Welch also to Oklahoma. There's a trend here. A lot of our major contributors ended up at Oklahoma. But now it's the favorite to win the job is Britton Williams, who spent a year at Georgia Southern like 4 years ago. I think played 2 years of junior college ball, and then was our kickoff specialist last year and just lost out on the starting job to Austin Welch. He's sort of an unknown, and I wish they brought in another kicker to maybe push him, but I think he's the favorite as of right now. He's another guy who, he's here because he wants to play. He left Southern because, he didn't see a pathway to, winning the starting job there, and, went the JUCO route. And the reason he's here is because, he wants to get on the field. So this is going to be his opportunity. I think right now it's his job to lose as the most experienced kicker we've got.
Well, now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into 2025?
Ooh, most concerning. It's hard to say concerning because expectations are low. Like we're not expecting any of these groups to be world beaters per se. I think the offensive line is confusing, but also intriguing. We just don't know. Like it was so bad at times last year that all you can say is, it's got to get better. But who's to say that you don't go 0 for 10 on these guys that you brought in, and it all falls apart, and then you're in a really bad spot because if the offensive line falls apart, it's good luck to your quarterback and good luck to your receivers and your running game. So I would say that's probably where my mind's at in regards to concerning. Defensive line too, didn't have the greatest pass rush last year, but it's the same thing. It's like, okay, well, if they're not great again, then it's just kind of a lateral progression from last year. It'd be hard to see less out of the pass rush. So
in today's age of NIL, revenue sharing, and the transfer portal, how have you seen that change Kennesaw State's recruiting philosophy?
There's been more buy-in in the last year since the Jerry Mack hire. There's more money coming in. There's more money going out to players. I don't have an official number on this, but from what I've heard is Dexter Williams got a nice little check, which would be by far the biggest any player has ever gotten, in the history of the football program, which, doesn't go back too far. But there's been more buy-in. I think the school is trying. There's been a lot more initiative to raise money and to put money into the program. You're seeing now us fill up the schedule over the next 5 years with a lot of these bye games. We got Indiana on the schedule now twice. They're going to be giving us $1.3 million for each game. North Carolina is giving us 1.5 for 2 games. Wake's giving us, I think, 600,000. And then there's a handful of others where we're bringing some money in. So it's going to be a long process. And I think they got the right guy in Jerry Mack to do it. He's a very personable coach, very good at doing all the extra stuff in terms of talking to the important people, the powers that be, and getting people to invest. And right now, when you're in the honeymoon phase where you don't know what this era is going to look like, you really got to capitalize on that. It's a lot easier when you've got a clean slate and, you haven't lost any games yet to get people to buy in and sell people on this process rather than just, try and start doing it next year after you have a 3-9 season. You gotta give people a reason to buy into the program, whether that be administration or donors or even students and just the people who are willing to spend their money to support the program.
What do you think the main strength of this 2025 team will be?
That's a great question. I think ambition. Like I said, you got a lot of young coaches. You've got a roster that's mixed with young talent and guys who maybe didn't think they got a fair look at their previous school, who now have a chance to be the man at their position. And I think you have a lot of guys, coaches and players that have something to prove. and I'm not saying you didn't have any of that last year. Obviously those guys cared and took their jobs very seriously, but that did sort of feel like the era was ending before your eyes. And there's a lot of uncertainty of, are we going to have our coach by the end of the season? Do we need to start looking at the portal by midseason because we're 0-6? It's like now guys really have a reason to get behind this movement, I guess. And you're not just running out there to be clobbered and take the lumps because it's your first year in FBS. It's like, okay, this is the first year where we can really build something.
What does this success look like for the Owls in 2025?
From a win-loss standpoint, I think if you could get to 4-8, people would be fairly happy. At least the reasonable people. I think there's an outside chance they compete for a bowl game. I mean, even last year, with as bad as we were last year, we were 2 or 3 plays away from winning 4 or 5 games, and not 2. We were also 2 or 3 plays away from winning 0. The 3 through 12 in Conference USA, like you mentioned, really kind of up for grabs. A lot of uncertainty there. A lot of programs who struggled in the previous year. So there's a lot for the taking. Like, if this team marginally improves, they can win some of these Tuesday night games against the Louisiana Techs of the world, against the Middle Tennessee States of the world, against the UTEPs. Like I said, as bad as we were last year, and you really saw that in the non-conference. I mean, you lost a game to an FCS team. We were still competitive in most of those conference games. There were a handful of exceptions, but we were in a couple of those that we could have won, and it just didn't go our way. I mean, we went to double overtime with UTEP and lost that one. If it weren't for a late punt return touchdown, had a real chance to beat Middle Tennessee State, midway through the season. Took Sam Houston to overtime. So, if there's marginal improvement, you've got a chance to flip some of these games. And I think if you could get to 4 or 5 wins, people would be happy, especially with a tough non-conference schedule when you got Wake Forest and Indiana first 2 weeks of the year.
Looking at that schedule, is there a stretch of games that you feel like is the most critical for their success?
Have to be probably the midweek games. I don't remember the schedule from memory, so I'll pull it up right in front of me so I can name some names. But I mean, early in the season, you get Wake Forest and Indiana. Those are games that you don't want the players and coaches thinking this, but they're in the back of your mind. As fans, you are kind of like, writing those off as losses. You get Merrimack. Yeah, just stay healthy, just get through it, get the check and get out. But once you get past that, you got a game against Merrimack, which is a game that you need to win. You got to beat the FCS team on your schedule. And then you got Arkansas State as your last non-con. And then, middle of the season, that start of conference play, MTSU, Louisiana Tech, FIU, UTEP, New Mexico State. 5 straight teams that weren't all that great last season. You're going to have a chance to win all of those games. Unless one of those programs is doing something to turn around that I just wouldn't anticipate. So I think that's going to be your bread and butter. I mean, you got a chance, things go right, to start 3-2 in conference play. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation or an unreasonable desire. Expectation. I wouldn't go that far, but that middle of the schedule before you start playing some of the tougher Conference USA teams, I think is going to be really important.
Well, Kyle, we've covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything else you want to share, think that we should know about this 2025 Kennesaw State Owls football team?
No, I think we touched on just about everything. Made pretty good time doing it too.
Well, we want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge of Kennesaw State football. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again.
If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.